So now we're going to talk about the weaknesses or the kind of reasons why natural law might not be a helpful approach to sexual ethics. Pre-warning, there are more of these than there are strengths. And I think arguably that's indicative of, or that kind of, should show you that natural law isn't necessarily in keeping with what the general consensus is, or what we tend to think now in relation to how we should approach sexual ethics. Kind of gives you a bit of a hint that it's a little bit dated, shall we say. Okay, so the first kind of big issue, which is always going to be an issue with Aquinas and his ideas of telos and natural law, or telos in general, to be fair, is that if you're not going to accept that God exists, then ultimately there's no reason to follow God's rules and God's laws, and that applies to kind of the divine law as revealed from the scripture in relation to how you should behave sexually. So, thou shalt not commit adultery, go forth and multiply. All of those rules come from supposedly God. And if you don't believe in God, what's the point in following the scripture? What's the point in following the primary precepts or any of it? It's all based on the fundamental premise that, or the fundamental kind of premise that God exists. If you disagree with that initial premise, then all of his kind of arguments for how we should and should not conduct ourselves in terms of sexual relations, so premarital sex, extramarital sex, homosexuality, none of them really apply if we don't accept that God exists. Although it has been kind of argued or countered by Hugo Grotius that he sort of said that essentially the ideas contained within natural law are built on the way that the universe itself is, so the universe and kind of observations, like empirical observations from it. And so he would argue that natural law still applies even if God doesn't exist, because it's just kind of based on observing the way that we are as humans, observing the way that the world works, and kind of using that to generate rules on how we should and shouldn't behave, which is a problem in itself that we'll get to in just a moment. So first problem is, if you don't believe God exists, then why are you going to follow any of these ideas of natural law? Second issue, little quote for you there. Dear Aquinas, to assume makes an ass out of you, me. So it's kind of a quick way of remembering how to spell assume, because it's A-S-S-U-M-E. I'm waiting for laughter here, but I'm on a video and that's weird, so I'm just going to carry on. So the idea that we all have like a telos, a purpose, etc., it's problematic. It's based on a lot of assumptions. It's assuming that we even, as an individual people, as a kind of a race, have got this special purpose, this special unique telos, and that it is exactly what Aquinas is suggesting that it is, to use our reason to be inclined towards good, to be closer to God, etc. He hasn't proved any of those claims. They're all just assumptions that he uses within his argument. He's given some evidence for the inclination as to how humans behave. So he's given what we call kind of anecdotal evidence. So after the fact, he's looked back and gone, oh yeah, okay, well that's generally how humans behave. So therefore, but it's not sound. It's not. I don't know. No, I don't think it's sound because I don't think it's actually true. So it's a poor inductive argument, is what I'd say. Certainly nowhere near a deductive one, but that's, I guess, not what he's aiming for. Anyway, so my point being, there's a lot of assumptions that have been made about how we are inclined to behave and why we're inclined to behave that way. So he's making a lot of assumptions about humans and our purpose. Okay, and if you don't accept those assumptions, then his entire argument falls apart. But he's also not just making assumptions about us as kind of human beings, but he's also making assumptions about sexual acts. So he's assuming that the purposes are to generative and unitive. So he's assuming that we have sex in order to create children and to feel united and kind of bonded with our spouse. That's not necessarily the case. He hasn't proven that. Again, he has got some evidence to suggest that based on previous actions of human beings, but he has in no way proven that that is how humans have to or should act. And that is necessarily what the purpose of sexual acts is. I mean, sexual acts could easily just be about pleasure. We've been designed, if he wants to talk about kind of like, the purpose of things and looking at kind of the function and things being obvious, you look at a penis, you look at a vulva, you assume that those two things must fit together. Okay, but maybe we look at the tip of a penis and we look at a clitoris and we assume, well, a lot of nerve endings on both of those, clearly that's for pleasure, it's for stimulating. Why else would we have kind of been designed with something so sensitive that brings about so much pleasure if it weren't to be used? So, yeah, arguably, you can see kind of a different purpose. There's an assumption that the purpose of sexual acts, rather the telos, is for, as I say, procreation and unity, generation and unity. But he hasn't actually proven that. It could just as easily be for pleasure. So the next issue is more to do with his kind of attitudes towards homosexuality. So the argument presented by natural law is that kind of like, we have these sexual urges which are within us and kind of lead us to by instinct go off and want to pair off, want to procreate, etc. And that's therefore the way that things should be. Well, by the same token, people have homosexual urges kind of built in them naturally, a part of them. So there's nothing really to suggest that that isn't how people who have those urges built in them, those natural inclinations, should. There's nothing to suggest that they shouldn't behave and act on those urges any more so than a heterosexual person would act on theirs. Yeah, so if we're going to say that these sexual desires, these sexual urges are natural and just like the way that we are supposed to function as a human being, then by the same token, so are so are homosexual sexual urges as well. So they're both just as kind of natural and inbuilt within us. So if you remember from a couple of lessons ago, this kind of coincides with what Norman Pissinger's view of natural law, who kind of made the same claim. So as I say, these criticisms, again, just to remind you, are more to do with Aquinas' interpretation than natural law, full stop. But yeah, yeah, a big issue that I've kind of hinted at thus far, the naturalistic fallacy. So you remember Hume and his is-ought gap. We can't necessarily move from observations of the world, the way the world is, to assumptions about the way the world ought to be. Just because you observe that people tend to pair off doesn't mean that's how people ought to behave. Just because you observe that people tend to kind of want to procreate doesn't mean that's how things ought to be. There is a gap between these two things. So the naturalistic fallacy, meaning that we're making a mistake, an error in our reasoning, in our argument, because we're assuming that because something is quote unquote natural, it's the way that things should be. There have been lots of cases throughout history where things have been considered natural, that we've now certainly got very different perspectives on. Even when it comes to ideas about kind of race and segregation of people, etc. We've certainly held the beliefs as human beings throughout history that kind of certain races are superior to others, etc., and that certain races are naturally more inclined to be intelligent or to be brutish and animalistic, if you want to quote Hume himself there. But yeah, so there's an assumption that just because something is quote unquote natural and the way that things tend to be or are within the world, that can be then turned into a moral judgment about how things should be and how things ought to be in the world. That's not necessarily the case. Just because something is true and we've observed it in the past doesn't mean to say it should continue to be the case or ought to continue to be the case in the future. The next criticism, one for the Golden Oldies. So, according to Aquinas and his rather restrictive, well, I say that, the Catholic Church has certainly turned them into very restrictive and very legislative kind of ideas. So, rather than just kind of principles that were intended to offer guidance, which is what Aquinas originally wanted, the Catholic Church in particular has turned a lot of his ideas into kind of like prescriptive laws, like this is what you must do, this is what you must not do, blah 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 blah. Whereas Aquinas was more intending to get you to kind of think, well, this is generally a good idea, but use your reason to kind of work it out. Because remember, he thinks that that's what makes us unique as humans, using our ability to reason and make judgments for ourselves. But anyway, so using a fairly restrictive version of natural law that Aquinas himself even intended, if we're going to say that, you know, the only reason you're supposed to be having a sex, the only reason that a man's supposed to be ejaculating is because we're trying to procreate, well, then there are lots of other things that kind of we would like to be permitted but aren't permitted. Of course, kind of things like oral sex, anal sex, masturbation, but also like it causes issues for people who are infertile. If you are if you're unable to have a child for biological reasons, or even if you just choose not to for emotional reasons, mental health reasons, etc., then it's kind of saying that you are not allowed to have sex with your partner. It's also saying that if you are, you know, elderly, then there's no point in having sex. As women, we go through menopause, which is kind of like the opposite, I guess, of going through puberty and kind of starting your period. Menopause essentially means that women stop having their monthly cycle and stop releasing eggs, and so they become naturally infertile. And at that point, does that mean that women are no longer allowed to have sex? If an elderly person isn't able to conceive a child, do you want to turn around to them and say that they're not allowed to have sex? I mean, I'm sure some of you probably want to, as I mentioned that thought, but ethically speaking, should we turn around and restrict people from kind of showing love and care and affection for their partners just because they're not capable or physically able to have children and to conceive? So remember, according to natural law, both the unity and the procreation element of the purpose of sex need to be kind of fulfilled every time. So that's why they would say that no, if you're elderly, stop having sex if you can't have any babies anymore. Other issues, final issue rather, is that it's just generally a little bit out of date. A bit like women who have their hair in side partings rather than middle partings. It's a little bit of a dated idea. So there are lots of things, again, going back to the Catholic Church in particular, that are being taught are immoral. We're being taught are immoral because of the ideas from natural law. So, as I mentioned before, kind of homosexuality, masturbation, use of contraception, which frankly is problematic because, you know, there have been a lot of people who have died because of the Catholic Church historically on contraception. There have been a lot of people who have been in heterosexual relationships, homosexual relationships, etc., and have chosen not to use contraception because the Catholic Church forbids it, and have subsequently died from things such as contracting HIV and that eventually turning into AIDS. So yeah, definitely problematic there. But it's not just that, it's their approach to things like in vitro fertilization, so IVF, where you help a couple if by having sex naturally, if say the mobility of your sperm is quite low, so the sperm isn't travelling fast enough in order to meet the egg, or you have what's known as an inhospitable womb, so your womb just doesn't really like sperm and doesn't allow it to stay around for very long. You might have trouble conceiving because physically the sperm and the egg are going to have trouble kind of finding each other. These days, we have things like IVF, which can help couples who have fertility problems like those, because the sperm and the egg are taken separately, so it's kind of taken from the man and the woman, and their the egg is fertilized in not a test tube but a petri dish. So it's known as test tube babies. But essentially, that kind of avoids the problems of the two things not finding each other once they're once the egg has been fertilized. You'll then implant it back inside the woman in order to hopefully grow into a child. So that's kind of an amazing ability and gift that we have from science, arguably also from God, which can help couples to have children who are happy, healthy, and very much wanted and desired. But according to natural law and their ideas of what sex should be for, even that is immoral. So even if it's a heterosexual couple having a child within marriage as an expression of their love and unity, it's still not allowed according to natural law. So that's the last issue with natural law.